I am gonna just do a quick little overview of pros and cons of going through insurance, what to expect when starting therapy, and seeking a therapist that aligns with your values, and then talk a little bit about after the intake and what to expect, in terms of self-care and how to better prepare. And then we'll go into breakout groups to talk more deeply about what each of us is looking for out of therapy and stuff. So I think, in terms of talking about insurance, is money a factor? It's kind of a funny question because isn't money always a factor? But I think it's important to I always like to think about what is like the opportunity cost, right? So look at your copay, and if your copay is like I had a job, my last job, my copay was like $70, which was the same as the out-of-pocket fee for many of the queer therapists here in New York City. So it didn't actually make sense in the end for me to use my insurance because the copay was so high that I might as well pay the out-of-pocket and see the therapist that I wanted to see. So that's why I kind of included that as a question here. So it's something to look at. It's also important to just look at your insurance because that will determine, where, if you are going to use your insurance, then that's probably a good place to start in terms of like searching through directories to see who is available in your area. Which leads me to my next question of where do you live? Do you live in a state or a city where queer affirming therapy is easily accessible, or do you live more in a city or state where people are less queer affirming or trans affirming, and you may encounter therapists and clinicians who are also not affirming or even harmful? So that's, something to think about. And again, kind of going back to the earlier questions and seeing maybe is it worth seeing somebody virtually. I think a lot of places are doing virtual therapy and sliding scale due to the pandemic, which I think that's great. I think we should do that all the time anyway. And then the other question I have on here of questions to consider is, what kind of support are you really looking for? I think a lot of times people point to therapy as kind of a catch-all, like, oh, you're going through some struggle in your life, you should go to therapy. And I think there is a lot of value in therapy if you are ready for therapy, if what you are looking for is a therapeutic relationship. And I think everyone can benefit from that in addition to other things. If you are somebody that is really like isolated in an experience, either of having a queer child or of being queer, I think a lot of times it can be helpful to be part of a support group or a space where you can meet other people who are like you, like a space like DC Rainbow where you can meet other parents of DC queer kids, or actual, DC queer folks, if that is your identity. And seeing yourself reflected in that way, I think has a lot of value and can lead you to events like this where you can get your questions answered to find a good therapist. Some other things I have on here are like spiritual guidance. I think a lot of times people are pointed to therapy and not always, people aren't being heard sometimes if they have strong religious values, that people are like, oh yeah, go to therapy. And like therapists are not always coming to their practice with a spiritual lens. So sometimes it can be more helpful and potentially faster to find like a spiritual community that is queer affirming or trans affirming and have that need kind of met in that way and maybe guide you towards other practitioners. I will be honest, I don't know like a ton of like South Asian queer practitioners outside of like 2 people that I graduated with. So I perhaps other folks in the room when we get to that part can share more about that. The other 2 things I wrote under here about what kind of support you need are thinking about if you need crisis support. And if that is the case, maybe keeping that in mind in terms of like what you're looking for, right? And maybe that is something that is like a hotline or more emergent support or not. But if you are feeling like you're in a crisis, then that is something to think about. And the severity of your mental illness, right? Like some of the things that I offered, like support group or a spiritual community, is not necessarily going to be helpful if you are experiencing severe mental illness or like a crisis, right? Another question that I was asked to talk about are how to find a therapist that aligns with your values. So I think a lot of times a good place to start is by reading somebody's bio. And in a lot of on like Psychology Today or on therapists' websites, they will have their bio that has their name and different information about themselves, organizations which they've worked for, what kind of practices they use. I think later we're going to talk about the different kinds of therapy like CBT and DBT. So that can be an indicator of what their values are. I think another way to see is like if somebody states their identity and like what words they use to describe themselves, right? Are they queer? Are they trans? Do they identify as South Asian or Muslim, if that's important for you? Just, depends like what it is that you're looking for. And I think, we have a lot of folks with experience here on cultural competency in the room, so we can talk more about that if that's like of interest to people later on. And I think the best way is really to just ask your therapist, if you have concerns about, does this person have the same values as you, and I'm curious like what some of those values might be that people are looking for. I think for me, like obvious ones that come to mind are around like not political, political identity. I think like queerness is sometimes a political identity, as well as like affirmation. Not somebody that is like really old school or that's not the right word, but someone who's not going to belittle me or try to come for my identity. I think another good way to find values is, if you're looking for particular types of organizations. So I have a lot of experience working with survivors. And so in that context, I would direct people towards anti-violence organizations so that they could get in contact with a therapist who would be able to serve their needs in that context, right? So in the context of the harm that they have experienced. So I think in the context of the audience here, like I would definitely want somebody who has experience working with the LGBTQ community and is really well versed in like what the various mental health concerns are for our community.
One of the values that I look for is having a therapist that's trauma informed, because that takes a specific type of mindset and a specific set of skills. And someone with lived experience with complex PTSD, that is something that I look for when I'm therapy shopping.
Yeah, that's a really important one. Thank you for bringing that up. Just in what you said, like you captured so many things. I think one thing to look for if folks are not familiar with CPTSD is complex PTSD, which is not something that all therapists like particularly are well versed in or even recognize in their practice. So the difference, if I think that can be like an assessment when talking to someone and asking them if they're familiar with complex PTSD and how they treat folks who are experiencing that. If you are a trauma survivor, if that's something that you are looking for support with. So some words that people look for are BIPOC and CBT. Yeah, so BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, people of color. So if you're looking for somebody, again, like identity, who has a shared identity or a non-white identity that you may better be able to identify with or relate with, and that person may better be able to understand you than someone else. And for folks who don't know, CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a very common therapy that is used to treat anxiety. And we can talk more about that a little bit later in the breakout rooms. So in terms of what to expect, I have some things here. So therapy cannot change your environment socially, economically, etc. So, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times therapy gets put in this catch-all basket, right? Of like, oh, you're like sad or you're upset, like life's not going well. Oh, you should go to therapy. But therapy is not going to change your job or your like mom who is homophobic or like things that are in your environment, so to speak. What therapy can do is help you cope with those difficulties, whatever those difficulties may be in your life, and to make changes, whether immediate or in the future, right? I think the analogy that I use is you're in the driver's seat. So for that 45 minutes a week or a month or every other week, however often you are engaging in whatever this therapy practice is, it's a time for you to be in the driver's seat and to really explore what you want to do and talk about whatever is going on in your life. So when you first start therapy, for folks who have never gone through this process before, after you reach out to someone, they'll likely schedule an intake with you. And during this time, they will ask you a series of questions where they were like kind of like gathering information, where the therapist will gather information from you. So that intake will depend on what service you are seeking. So if you are looking for support with depression or anxiety, the intake will likely have questions related to that. If you're looking for support with CPTSD or PTSD or neurodivergency like ADHD or autism, there may be questions around that. I think generally, if you're just like looking for a space to talk about what's going on in your life and have that space, a lot of times therapists will do the general screenings for depression and anxiety. Does anyone have any questions around what to expect during intake or from your therapist?
So I like to think of intake as kind of like the intake for physical things too. I think I've seen a lot of people be intimidated by therapy intakes, but it's similar to when you go to a doctor for physical ailments, basically trying to suss out what's happening. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a really good point. So we're just asking a lot of different questions to kind of get a holistic picture of what is going on for you and where we might be able to support. So another thing actually that you just reminded me of is the biopsychosocial, which in my practice, I do something where I add a spiritual element and I ask folks about their spiritual health as well. But the biopsychosocial is something that a lot of social workers and therapists use as a way to assess their clients' health and mental health. So there are questions related to your biological health, like how often you're eating and sleeping, and questions along those lines. There's questions around your psychological health, so your mood and your stress levels, things of that nature, and then questions about your social health. So your social supports in your life, who you hang out with, and things around that. So these are questions that are designed to give the therapist a holistic picture of you and an opportunity for you to share with that person what's going on for you and what you're hoping to get from them. Which is why I wrote here, it's really important to identify problems in order to reach solutions. I think it's great if you're just looking for a space to talk. I think that's a great reason to do therapy. And I think a lot of times people go into therapy with a lot of expectations that are sometimes unspoken between them and their therapist. And so it's also important, if you have specific goals in mind or things that you are hoping to get from your therapist, to be really clear about that during intake or during the first few sessions to see if this is a good fit. So I have some resources here that I think are a good place to look. So if you are using insurance and you looked at your copay and stuff, and that's the place where you want to start, Psychology Today and ZocDoc are good resources, particularly if you're looking for a psychiatrist. I think ZocDoc is a good option. And then if you're looking specifically for a queer or trans of color therapist, the National Queer and Trans Therapists of Color Network, that's the NQTTCN directory that I have listed there. That link, if you just Google that and directory, you'll be able to find it. And they have a great list of different therapists that you can look through and see if they if they are in your budget or with your insurance. For folks in the Philadelphia area, Radical Therapy Center is a great place. And Sonali is a South Asian therapist who works there and does a lot of community education as well as mental health therapy work around body positivity and countering fat phobia, as well as mental health in the South Asian community and anti-caste work and other things. Queer Crescent is a great up-and-coming organization that works with LGBT Muslims and their families. And they have good mental health resources as well as like support groups and things like that. The Alchemistic Studio is a South Asian queer yoga studio that is virtual. So if you're looking for, body work or exercise or however you see yoga, I think that's a good option. And then the other two lists at the bottom, they have support groups that are virtual. I think SACS is on hiatus right now for another month or two, but the Fireweed Collective has groups that you can register for online. So that's a good resource.